Insurgency, Insurgency, our Insurgency, our guest presenter is Lieutenant Colonel Mark Ulrich from here in the Coin Center. Before I introduce him, I would like to say a few things about the program. If you have a question for the presenter, you can type it anytime into the chat pod in the virtual meeting room, and Colonel Ulrich will get to it at some point in the conversation. In order to preserve bandwidth and improve functionality for everybody, we do not offer participants voice capability in this virtual meeting. If you have a technical connectivity issue or something like that, please send it to us in the private chat box. This briefing is unclassified, so please ensure that all questions remain unclassified. Now about our presenter, Colonel Ulrich has served 23 years in the United States Army. He's a career Special Forces officer. He has spent nearly all his career studying insurgencies. He has accumulated quite a bit of knowledge about that. So he's chosen today to talk about the dynamics of insurgency, and he's using some contemporary situations as illustrations on how we can use dynamics to evaluate the nature of an insurgency and determining if indeed an insurgency actually exists in the first place. So, Colonel Ulrich, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, sir.
All right, thank you, Bud. The reason we're looking at the topic of insurgency is I've worked at different coin centers, read counterinsurgency manuals. There's a lot of books on counterinsurgencies. There's a lot of reading lists about counterinsurgencies. There's seminars, workshops, and those are all good. And I've actually learned quite a bit from the input of so many different experts in the field, subject matter experts, as we call them. What kind of was a little curious to me was why there was no insurgents experts, or there are, of course, but doesn't seem to be as proportional, or insurgent seminars and workshops, and there are a few out there, different panels, but it was always kind of curious to me that how could you be that far along in countering an insurgency when we're not, I don't think, as far along as understanding insurgencies. Now, I'm not talking about attacking networks, and I'm not talking about tactics, and I'm not talking about IEDs. I am talking about strategies of insurgencies, their campaign plan. And sometimes when in different lectures I give, when I say campaign plan, it rolls people back a little bit on their heels. They say insurgents can't have campaign plans. They're not generals. And I remind them that the regulations for us is a little different probably for them. Their theater is probably different than ours. We define our space or our terrain different than they do. They look at things like time different than we do. So there's quite a lot of differences between the two, and that's why I thought today would be kind of an interesting topic. Now, the way we're going to do it today is start with a couple structural things, and hopefully it won't be too dry, but then move into something a little lighter and talk about something that we see kind of going on today, and I'm going to give you a kind of an anecdote that I had. All right. We are now in the process of working on FM 324 with many other people, and I can remember being a consultant on other manuals, how much time let's say the experts argued about the definition of insurgency or counterinsurgency, and it's important to get it right. And that's really not my field to get that detailed into the actual wording. I let that up to others. I'm more of on the practitioner side, I think, that I contribute. But even though we just did a conference, I would say that this isn't far off. However, the reason I'm putting this up is not to offer an alternative definition, but I'm constantly hearing that insurgencies are new, or we're in a new insurgency, or there's a new threat out there. And that's something that, though true, there's always new details. I think that there are enduring principles, and in this case, today's topic, dynamics, that help to govern and us understand an insurgency. I mean, this quote, obviously, 2,400 years old. I don't believe insurgencies are new. And though every single insurgency has uniqueness, in fact, If you're in one end of the theater or the other end of town from another, there'll be some differences. But what we want to talk about today is some of those enduring principles. I mean, when we study principles of war, we still study Roman battles, and because we know that these principles will stand the test of time. That's why they're called principles. Next. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of basic opening structure before we get to kind of the lighter side. All right, the insurgency dynamics have basically two purposes. And I remember I was asked once, we were doing a briefing for a couple senior officers, some general officers, and it was kind of informal. I mean, it wasn't informal, but there was only a few around the table. And they said, Mark, why is there really no methodology for understanding insurgencies? He goes, I've been reading books since the 9/11, trying to get smart on this. I read all the time, but it doesn't seem like in all these books on insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, there's a methodology to figuring out an insurgency. And I said, well, sir, I believe there is a methodology, and that's the dynamics of insurgency. Now, the dynamics of insurgency can be found in FM 324, FM 324.2, the tactics coin, JP 324, joint coin, and AJP 344, NATO coin, as well as pretty much most every special forces book from FID to unconventional warfare. Now, we all plagiarized these dynamics. We didn't come up with them. Insurgents did. Thus, they are insurgent dynamics. And a lot of the scholarship that's out there that we look at, and I'll get to this in a moment, is because insurgents write books too. It's just that we don't always put them on our reading list, and that's what I want to kind of encourage today. The insurgent dynamics are a methodology, and they basically do two things. The first, and I hope you can see this, is that in each dynamic, and we'll go through each dynamic, but in each dynamic, you can find specific weaknesses that you can exploit. And we'll talk about those throughout when we get to kind of the context of the discussion. So each individual dynamics, there are 8, you can find weaknesses. Those weaknesses can be between the population and the insurgency, something the insurgencies aren't doing well, or the movement's not doing well between them and the people, or it could be an internal problem that we might be able to exploit to weaken the actual movement. The other thing the dynamics do is, as a methodology, all 8, when analyzed, which we'll do now today, will help you determine what strategy the enemy is using. The strategy is basically how they're going to accomplish their goals. From strategy, and there are some doctrinal. Okay, thank you. From strategy, and this is something we used to study all the time when it came to the Soviets, when it came to, we even had whole books on the enemy strategy, and there are plenty of books on strategy, but we don't seem to really grasp or gravitate towards understanding the strategy of the insurgency, but instead more of the tactics of the insurgency. So today we're going to talk about the strategy of the insurgency and how that helps us. Once we understand their strategy, we match basically what they want to do up with what they're able to do, or their capabilities. All right? When you match these two basic up, what they want to do, their strategy, and how, and if they're able to, and under our assessment, you'll start to enter the decision cycle on what they can and can't do. We basically call this most probable and most dangerous course of action. I would say that if they are capable of doing something that is outlined in their strategy, that is the most probable course of action. If we assess that they are not able to, we don't think, we assume that they can't do it at this time, but it is part of their strategy, I would call that a most dangerous course of action. All right. From then we go on to operations. What kind of operations are they conducting? And finally we get to tactics and order of battle, or what's now called threat characteristics, which is the composition, disposition, strengths, and so forth. If you notice, the arrows are going down, where many times we go the other direction. We see an event, one at the bottom, tactics. Let's say an increase in local assassinations like we saw in Kandahar last year. And we ask why. And we're trying to go up. We're trying to look at a task and try and figure out a purpose, when that's very difficult. As opposed to looking at the purpose. And usually you can figure out tasks if you do understand the purpose. So we're going to kind of go the other direction today. Now, as far as the insurgent campaign plan, unilaterally an insurgency can't really perform. All right, it does need other things for it to have a complete plan on how it's doing. But there is the insurgency itself and their strategy, their personnel, their operations, and so forth. But what do they need to have this campaign plan? They need the population. Now we say this: the population is the center of gravity. I would say that's both true and untrue. I think it's a little too generic a phrase. It would usually be an aspect of the population based on the operation they're trying to accomplish. For example, if they want to interdict the road, that would be their operational goal. If they want to do it on Tuesday with a bomb at this grid coordinate, that would be their tactical. And so the people they need to give them passive and active support would be the people around the road that would basically either turn them in or not turn them in. In other words, allow them freedom of movement or deny them freedom of movement. How do we get the population if we're the insurgency, or the counterinsurgency for that matter? We look at the causes of instability. So if there's an area where the population does not have causes of instability, we call prerequisites of insurgency. In other words, they're not vulnerable, they don't lack government control, they don't lack security, they don't lack the police force and so forth. Generally the population would not be able to, or the insurgency would not be able to move as freely through that population as they need to. Now, I recently was asked to go speak at some universities. One was Michigan, and I was trying to figure out what to talk about to the faculty and to the students. And when I got there, they said, "Well, you're in the Army, you were in Afghanistan, you're in the Special Forces. Can you tell us a war story?" A war story, okay. So I said, "All right, I'll tell you a war story." And this is a true story. And the way it goes was, last November, I was in Oakland, and I ran into some occupiers. I didn't run onto them on the street. Basically, I was out there visiting a friend. I just got back from 24 months in theater. And that's significant to the story because I was probably in the mindset of, when you're over there, it's kind of a seven days a week. It's kind of an all business environment. So I wasn't probably doing a lot of small talk and chit chat. I was kind of still in that kind of all business mentality. But I'm out visiting a friend. He just opened a restaurant out there in Piedmont. And we're out, he's running some errands, and he says, "Hey, why don't you walk around? You got 30, 40 minutes to kill before I'm done with what I need to do." And I said, "All right." So I walked around, and I ran into this bookstore, new used bookstore. Now, probably like a lot of you can definitely kill 30 minutes in a bookstore. So I walked in, and, it's a typical new used bookstore. And as I'm walking through it, and it's good size, I see this giant sign over this row of books called Revolution, which, of course, was, jackpot. Excellent. So I'm walking down through this aisle, and I'm just finding all these great books. I'm finding, and they're all about insurgents, at least the ones I'm looking at. Books like The Wretched Earth by Frantz Fanon. And you can certainly email me after this if you want any of these titles. He was a French citizen, Caribbean-born, in mental health sciences, psychiatry or what have you, psychology. And he went to support the French troops in Algeria, if they had the PTSD. And then he switched sides. And he wrote books on, and basically he's one of the architects of what we call the urban strategy, or that strategy that uses small underground guerrilla cells, compartmentalized to attack targets, to make the population or the government overreact against the population, something we see in quite a few wars. It's also in all the FMs I listed earlier. I saw Mini Manual on Guerrilla Warfare by Marighella. He was a Brazilian legislator and head of the insurgency out there. He wrote basically on how to be a guerrilla in the urban environment. Obviously, different works on Mao. I found Che Guevara's book, Diary of the Congo. I didn't even know he had a diary from the Congo. I know about the one in Bolivia. So anyways, I got all these great books. I basically can't carry anymore. So I start walking towards the front of the store. And at the counter, there are these 4 occupiers, basically. They weren't occupying the store. They just worked there. But they were basically all just sort of hanging out. I'm not trying to stereotype, but you can kind of tell based on their kind of the way they were dressed and all the metal they had in their face, and they had this kind of rebel without a clue motif going. And so I probably shouldn't try and judge, but that's exactly what they did to me. I'm wearing normal street clothes, which probably looks formal compared to what they were wearing, and mine were laundered. So it was a bit of a contrast here. When they saw my books, which are all radical books, all written by insurgents or those that were supporting insurgency, and the way I was dressed, and it was simply just jeans and a t-shirt, And so they're looking at me, looking at my books, looking at me, looking at my books, and they were very confused. And then one of them, this thin little white guy with dreadlocks, and crazy kind of looking guy, he kind of said, "What is this, your hobby?" And like I said before, I was in that kind of post-theater, blunt, environment, so I wasn't trying to be a wise ass. I just literally said, "No, this is what I do for a living. It's my profession." And they're looking at me in my street clothes, and they're still kind of curious on how this could be my profession. And he said, "So you're here for the revolution?" Now, I'd only been back from theater about a month, but I had heard of the occupation, or Occupy Wall Street and Oakland or whatever. I wasn't certainly an expert on it, and so I didn't mean to be that blunt with him. I was kind of just being more matter of fact, and I said, "Oh, that's not a revolution." And he got all puffy, and he's like, "That's some big talk. You can't see me, but I'm 6 foot, 195 pounds. He was 5'5", 130, maybe add 5 pounds for all the metal he had in his face. But it really was not a contest. Even of the four of them, it would have been like clubbing baby seals. But what I'd realized, to my, I wouldn't say horror, but to my dismay, was I hadn't bought these books yet. So I just kind of insulted their whole lifestyle unintentionally. My bad, but it was unintentional. I was just kind of being more matter of fact, analytical, if you will. And I didn't have these books, and they might have kicked me out of their store. So I had to stall. Now you can say, well, you got the titles of the books, why don't you just go buy them online? You're not going to want to, maybe one of these books you can buy online, but you put all these books online, you're going to end up on a no-fly list. I mean, these are all radical books from different insurgencies. Besides, I wanted these books. So I said, well, let me explain, since I do this. I said, all revolutions are insurgencies. I mean, they have some sort of core. Now, I'm certain those are out there that say, what about this one example where it just spontaneously happened? I'm not talking about the one of 1,000. I'm talking about generally an insurgency is an impetus to a rebellion. A rebellion is where you go from insurgency, which has to have passive support, to a rebellion that has active support. You move to an uprising, which has a majority of active support. Then you move to a revolution, which has mobilized populations, and there's a difference. But you do need the insurgency. So I said, do you have a piece of paper? I'll explain. So they handed me a piece of paper, and I said, you need the 8 dynamics of insurgency. And from what I can see from your movement, you don't have really any of those. Now, you have to have them all. I mean, you really, when I look at it, you have to have at least 7 of the 8 to be an insurgency. You don't have to do them well, but you have to have them. And so I said the first one, for example, is leadership. Now, like I said, these are enduring. I mean, people say, well, how could all insurgencies be the same? I mean, all insurgencies have some sort of analysis of its leadership. Now, what I mean by leadership is we certainly think of the movement leader, but I'm talking about all the way down to the lowest cell leader, political wing leader, guerrilla leader, underground leader, or what have you. And when you analyze these leaders, you ask things like, how does the leader tie to the population? Is it coercive, or is it charismatic? Is there a combination? How well connected? Remember I said we look for weaknesses. If the leader, the only way he can get control of the people is through heavy-handedness, that's a weakness, because then the counterinsurgents' application of security can break that tie. As opposed to if they're loyal to cause, adding security will not break that tie. All right, so that's how we use them one at a time to analyze weaknesses. But also all 8 to analyze whether they have an insurgency or what strategy it is, or even if it's successful. So I said, you have this leadership. Now, I've always believed that you don't judge. You don't try and get emotionally editorialize an insurgency based on whether you think the cause is worthy, because then what happens is you might come out with an answer that is different than the course of action you should take. For example, many people think that anarchy is not a real cause because it's anarchy. They don't want the government, they want to destroy it. Or nihilism, from the Latin nil, which means nothing. They want, they don't want nothing. They want everybody else to have basically no government. Some even believe that because certain criminal organizations want money or terrain, that they're not insurgencies. I think you might win the doctrinal argument, but at the end of the day, you still might want to do counterinsurgency. So I try not to judge it. However, in leadership, it is difficult. From what I understand, the leader of the movement is an anarchist. That's kind of a paradox, I'm afraid. That you can't really have a leadership and a hierarchy and a chain of command made up of anarchists because they don't believe in chain of commands. They don't believe in leaders. So I said that's going to be a challenge for you. See, generally, when you're leaderless, it does, even if it's a flat organization and that leadership could be ideological, it could be a direction. It's important to look at those leaders and analyze them. For example, in the American Revolution, if the British were able to capture or eliminate George Washington, at certain points in the war would have been over. For instance, in early December '76, because of his skill set was basically keeping the Continental Army together. Same with T. Lawrence of the Arab Revolt against the Ottomans, the Turks. If they had gotten Lawrence, they might have replaced him with another dynamic person, but the reason he's so famous is because he's that unique. He wasn't an expert in guerrilla tactics. He was an expert in keeping those tribes together. However, since we've just seen the killing of bin Laden, by killing bin Laden, we did not eliminate al-Qaeda. All right? Nor did we think we would. Now, that can work at the top all the way down to the lowest cell in your tactical area. Do we analyze the leader to say how much of an impact is this leader have if he's taken out? What if the leader is not that effective, but his second in command is? Should we still just go for the leader because he's the leader, or should we maybe go for targeting the second in command who's actually running everything and is competent? Okay. So I said you have a problem with kind of leadership, but we'll move on. The second is ideology. Ideologies is similar to your strategic goal. It's not the same. It's basically, overall what you want, who you are, where a strategic goal is referring to which country you wanted it and more specifics. For example, you can have, your ideology could be religious extremists, and it could be political. They call it egalitarian, like a socialism or communism. And then your strategic goal would be in that country to overthrow that government. So that's kind of the similarities. And I said it also has to do with your messaging. So I said, right now, I don't think a lot of people understand your message. So I will craft your message for you. You just give me little pieces. I'm back in the bookstore. And I had my little piece of paper, and they still hadn't run out my book, so I still had to stall some more. And I said, all right, you just tell me what you want, and I'll put it into a narrative for you. And so they're looking around, and no one's saying anything. I said, just in your own words, what do you want? And one of them said, awareness. I said, good. Awareness is good. All right, awareness of what? And they looked around, and then one of them said, we're not going to take it anymore. I said, okay, you're not going to take what anymore? Besides a shower. And finally I said, all right, listen, you got to kind of put this in a little more of a direction you want to go. What are you actually looking to do? And one of them literally said, and this is a true war story. This is Oakland. No kidding, there it was. We want to, he said, the establishment. I said, what about the establishment? And one of them blurted out, we want to stick it to the establishment. And I stopped him. I said, wait a minute. I said, are you trying to tell me? I just had a flashback to 1987. Are you trying to tell me that you want to stick it to the man? That's your movement? That's what you want to do? And they got a little flustered and said, I said, I'll tell you what. Here's one of your problems when it comes to ideology and the reason you're not a movement. You have these guys that I think started the movement, and I think that's where they got some support from let's say, radical people, mainstream people. You have those that just are not too happy with what is going on with banks and investments and different things like that. Then you have these guys that want to actually change the entire system, not just correct the capitalist system, but actually change the governmental system, the economic system, the social system. Communist Party, whether they're socialist, communist, economic or political. Then you got these guys, radicals and anarchists. And, if we had more time, I can put in the other groups like criminals and homeless and about everybody else. There might be some political parties out there that are Big Ten parties. That's fine. But you can't have a Big Ten insurgency. You can't. You have to have a ideology. You can't have conflicting ideologies. What that is a weakness. We generally call groups that have conflicting ideologies splinter groups because they splinter, because they eventually get to the point where they break. Now, it's not always because of ideology, but generally it is. And when we think of a splinter group, we think of a radicalized group compared to the more progressive main body. That's how we already think of them. Now, would that help us in places like Afghanistan? If we understood that even at the local tactical level, that there's a conflict, ideological conflict within the local area. Are we asking those questions in our interrogations? Are we asking those questions when we debrief people from reintegration that are coming to our side? Do we say, is there any internal conflict? Do we look at enemy information operations and see if it's in conflict with either the greater movement or even locally? We talk about people like the FARC in Colombia, where I spent some time, and some say they're drug dealers, and some say they're socialists. Well, I think they're both right. It depends on which front you were talking about. But is there a way to discredit or divide or splinter the group, which of course we'd want to do? Also, like I said, it's your messaging. Ideology has to do with your messaging. In other words, are you justifying the violence? Are you justifying your occupation? That is part of ideology. Are you able to pass that message to the greater population? All right? And I think that though there are a lot of signs, and I found all these pictures yesterday, by the way, online. I know what she's trying to say. People are people, not prophets. But at all the signs I looked at, and I really found most of these pretty quickly, they probably need to have a little more of control. Now, I've never been a big fan of the control of I/O because I think it makes it too slow. But now maybe I'm changing my mind. You might want to have a little control about what the message is going out, because especially with the news and the media, they will pick up on, if they're opposed to your movement, they will pick on the one slide in there or the one sign in there that is an antithesis to actually your movement or what you're looking for. All right, the third one is objectives. Now, objective is actually critical. We say it in Principles of War, Weinberg Doctrine. I don't know of a lot of military theorists or practitioners that don't understand that you need a clear objective. Even a dynamic, it's its own dynamic, need objectives. Now, the objectives, like in other forms, come strategic, operational, tactical. Now, if you don't have a common ideology, it is very hard, if not impossible, to have a common strategic objective. But we are going to start to build our insurgent campaign plan, even if they don't really have one yet. So you have your strategic, we'll call that the desired political end state, and then you have basically 4 pillars, 4 triggers. You can have political objectives, military objectives, or paramilitary objectives. You can have social objectives, and you can have economic objectives. And I have some examples here that you can take a look at. All right? Political objectives, even at the lowest tactical level, they could disrupt elections. They could assassinate or capture or intimidate local politicians. These are all things. They can build a political wing. They have a basic strategy that is not part of their strategy. So I would not be a most probable, most dangerous course of action. But if they are assessed as a advanced strategy, like protracted or subversive, and this is a true story as well, then we assessed that they had a political wing, even though there was no evidence of it. There was all the indicators of it, and it turns out that they were actually building one. We just couldn't see it at the time. Right. Military ones are kind of, most of us in this forum are pretty used to these kind of interdicting our main supply routes and so forth. Again, these are operational objectives. Interdicting Highway 1 is the operational objective, even if it's at the tactical area. And the tactical one would be the actual event at the time and place. Social. Doesn't sound big, but it is big. They can influence education. They can start sectarian violence. We've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it almost derailed Iraq completely, was the social objectives, all right, when the Sunni-Shia kind of conflict part. And, of course, economic. Those could either be to disrupt our reconstruction, or it could be their own black market, extortion, kidnapping, drugs, gems, smuggling, and what have you. All right, that's kind of an idea of how their campaign plan works. Now, each one of those objectives, they would need the population in that area and, of course, the root causes so that they have freedom of movement. But basically, this is where I want to expand how we look at insurgencies. Insurgencies do three things. They do things we know they're doing. You know, explosion goes off, we know it happened. They are doing things right now that we don't know about. We didn't know that they were doing forging ID papers in the safe house in my AO, and what they're going to do in the future. Unfortunately, most of the time when we're not thinking strategy or top-down look, purpose versus task, for analysis, we are just looking at the first one. We are looking at what they're doing now and trying to figure it out, which is a little more reactive. Now, I'm not saying we're not doing the others. I'm just saying it might not be as proportional. And that's how the dynamics can help you. And that's how we use the dynamics in theater to make predictive analysis. And it did it recently. And at the end, I can also pass on some of those documents that are declassified. Now, here's an example of where they might be doing something social. They're writing books. I just saw this online. I also saw that some professors are even, you know, that ally themselves with the movement are even having college classes. So they are trying to get it into mainstream. Some of the new textbooks, I've heard people complain on the news, are saying that the occupation was this great thing for school children to read. All right, so they might have some. Remember, this was last November, so they might have made some advances since then. All right, economic objectives might be a symbolic target, like a branch of a bank. It really won't do anything to the bank if they break a few windows, but it's more for symbolic reasons, which is fine, because a lot of times your actions are designed for a greater strategic goal. Your tactical actions, if you're an insurgent, they could actually do violence for that symbolic thing. We call that armed propaganda when the actual event is designed specifically just for propaganda. And that's an example. Number 4, environment and geography. Now, most of us know all about this because we do terrain and weather analysis. This also has to do with the internal population, if you understand the culture and so forth. But we have internal support coming up, so we'll kind of focus on the people during that one. But it has to do with environment and geography. Now, when I first heard that the movement began, I think around September 2011, yeah, I'm from New York, in that area, to start a movement where you're going to sleep outside in the fall in New York City shows me that you do not understand your environment and geography. Now, they got away with it because it was a mild winter. But if anybody knows New England, and anybody knows the northern states, but if anybody's been to New York City, that's not something you want to sleep out in all winter long. That, to me, they did not understand that this is not when you start a movement. Now, I understand that a movement will start when it starts. Sometimes you can't really stop away from hitting the shore, but you can take a knee, take a tactical pause, say, you know what, we need to do some more planning and come out in the spring instead of putting all our effort right before the winter. Again, they did get lucky that it was not as strong a winter as normally it is, but there were some cases where they thinned their ranks simply because of acts of nature. All right, external support. Now, this out of the 8, in my personal opinion, is the 1 out of the 7 that you don't actually have to have. You don't have to have external support to have a movement. You can do it all internally. But you'll find throughout historical study that it's exceptionally rare to not have somebody externally supporting you, whether it's a state or a non-state actor. And there are those like, I believe it's Galula or Paget believes that in order to be successful, you do have to have external support. So I do want to get, there's some literature on this. I can't think of really that many insurgencies outside of coups in Brazil. Basically, that all happened very quickly. But I'm not talking about those kind of specific, very rare cases. I'm talking generally you're going to have some sort of external actor helping you. All right. Now, there was some evidence that there's occupations in Europe, Asia, and so forth. It could be because of the world crisis. It could be because there are people that are willing to do a demonstration, like you see in the G8, G20, different kind of meetings. All right. So I say I will give you that one. Now, there are 4 kinds of external support. There's the obvious one with resources. They provide you actual materials. There's sanctuary, which I'm not sure that this one really apply unless you've done something criminal and you try and escape a jurisdiction to another country. Moral support. That's where this one would come in because they are demonstrating, showing solidarity to your movement. That would be moral support. And political support if they were able to get politicians or states, governments, to recognize your movement. You might move away from, if you were an insurgency, which I don't think you are, but you would move possibly towards belligerent status. And generally, if you 2 or more constituted states recognize your insurgency, you are seen as a belligerent, which raises you from the illegal to the legal, basically. Number 6, internal support. All right, internal support is also, that's the local population. That comes basically in 2 strong flavors, passive and active. All right? And it also has the 4, resources, sanctuary, moral, and political. You can be provided resources internally in your own country or in this area. I would say it also would apply to the surroundings of where the park is, wherever you're occupying, as well as the whole country. All right? In this case, they were getting moral support, and maybe they were getting some donations from the ice cream from someone famous like this. All right? So they might be getting resources and moral support. Now, if you do something where you need sanctuary, you can certainly hide in someone's homes, literally like that. That's the same thing in Afghanistan. You can have internal sanctuary. They can be hiding people in certain communities and villages and so forth. The Pashtunwala kind of guarding them and so forth. So you certainly can have all these things in internal support. Moral support, that could backfire, or that could be something that is credible to your group. Again, when it comes to moral or even political support, you got to be careful because if you get somebody that is highly radicalized, then you might lose some of your general population that is giving you passive support or even a nod. When they start to see you align with certain people, maybe not this person, but certain people, this can actually hurt you. So you got to be careful. But I said that your internal support was good for a while. I was actually hearing people that I considered somewhat mainstream politically. In other words, they weren't radicalized, where it's actually saying, I support the movement. But I think that was before a lot of the violence, before they had to put up rape tents and the criminal activity. And then you started to lose all the store owners in your area because of all the vandalism, all the trash, and so forth. This, if you're an American, this is one of the fastest ways you lose support to Americans, is you burn the symbol of our nation. All right? So this is one of those things where, back to ideology, you might want to contain if you can. Again, whatever the movement is, if someone is opposed to it, namely the media, or in today's world, everybody's the media, if you're like a blogger or what have you, and you have a camera, which everybody has, you will be able to find the one guy that you didn't police up with a crazy sign with swastikas or craziness on it, and that will be, in their opinion, or they will try and demonstrate that that's the movement. So in today's media, this is a very, very difficult thing. You have to be very proactive with the right message to maintain internal, external support, and basically all those things. All right? It was one thing when they were occupying as peaceful occupiers. It was another thing when they were completely trashing the place Um, and I think this goes without saying, and this is one of 1,000 pictures I found. Number 7 of 8 is phases and timing. Now, many people think that Mao, what we call the protracted or the popular protracted war, is the one that used the 3 phases in. He's the one that wrote it down, but all insurgencies have phases. As doctrine states, all insurgencies can pass through the phases. They don't need to pass through them all to be victorious. Basically, the idea is we're so hardwired to think that you only do it in Mao. Well, basically, how would you get to guerrilla warfare if you didn't start in a development stage? How would you have fully armed guerrillas, cells, without indoctrination, training, recruiting, gathering materials? You need some sort of beginning. All right, here's just a quick look at the different phases. Now, the way I saw the movement, and I said I was partly in theater and partly here, so I didn't see everything, and I didn't really care. But you basically can have some violence in phase 1, but it's a lot of organization or even reorganization. You can go back to this phase. What you don't see on this slide, and we can certainly pass along as our IW Center and Fusion Cell has these materials, is a much more detailed one of each phase. We have high-end and low-end phases. The reason I think you have latent, which is something you can't see, and you have incipient, which is emerging and you can see, in other words. So low-end phase 1, what I would say would be propaganda. High-end phase 1 would be armed propaganda. Low-end phase 1 might be demonstrations. Though you can see demonstrations, you might not know it's a movement. High-end phase 1 would be riots. Low-end would be recruiting. High-end would be training, and so forth. All right, so it's not so linear. I think the problem is that they went from high-end phase 1 with no low-end phase 1. You can't do that. You basically went too fast, too far. Loved your momentum, went all the way to phase 3, where you were moving against law enforcement and police, and you had no plans, you had no rat lines, you had no reserves and resources, you had no. Basically, it was sort of a mob mentality, and that's where it kind of got away from you. That has a lot to do with phases. There is a lot of. It's very important to really understand the phases, so when you move from one level to another level, that you have all your members. And we'll talk about that in the 8th one. You have all your different elements and all your different propaganda machines or IO, media people. You have your logistics. You have all your pipe swingers. Everybody's kind of ready to go, because like a regular military, where we have combat arms and we have combat support and service support and all the others, we have to work as a team, and one group has to support the other group. Well, if you're kind of all over the map, it makes it difficult. And what happens is you have a lot of momentum and then you drop, and you have little or no organization. So I think you started in high phase 1 when you need to start at latent. Of course, you can't see it, so maybe I'm wrong. But pretty soon after the article came out from Adbusters in Canada, it basically went, I think, a little too quickly. Like I said, you kind of went right into that, and we're hoping a rebellion would carry it. This is not Egypt. This is the United States, and a riot in New York City is not going to topple anything. And once you were done with these kind of things, you kind of lost steam. So phases are something I consider exceptionally important. I think they're the most understudied aspect, and we have vast amounts of data on this for planning purposes, where you can have assumptions, and you certainly can contact us, and we'll send you those. All right, number 8, organizational operational patterns. That's just a fancy way of saying what's your structure. Now, in general terms, you have guerrillas, and many people will quote the use of guerrilla comes from the Iberian Peninsula, the wars in Spain and Portugal against Napoleon. That's commonly known, and it's fine. Guerra means war, ia means small, guerrilla is a Spanish word, but actually it's actually something that came from the United States, or let's say North America. In the 1600s, in the French and Indian Wars, not the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, but earlier in the 1600s, before the King Philip's War, it was called Petite Guerre, which meant small war. That's really where it came from, but that's just a little factoid. But this has been a term very, very long time, um, where it's still a Latin root, though this was French and that one was Spanish, or Portuguese as well. The gorilla is the pipe swinger. He is kinetic. You cannot be a passive gorilla. I've heard people say I'm a nonviolent gorilla. No, you're a warrior. You're a warrior, then you're a combatant. Um, or you're the one that is actually pulling triggers, or in this case, not pulling triggers, but perhaps throwing bottles. Auxiliary is your combat support and service support, and that is the vastness of your organization in general. Just like our combat support and service support is the vastness of our organization, and you can ask any tanker, any infantryman, how long they would last without combat support and service support, and they will tell you very, very short amount of time. And they probably didn't even get there in the first place. All right, so that is something that is vastly underestimated. A lot of people think they're sort of not really insurgents or not really in the movement. That's completely false. Intelligence, counterintelligence, logistics, transportation, medical, training, propaganda, or information operations, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, your underground are doing more of the covert type operations, or in some cases, clandestine type operations. Um, and they are doing some of the things that might be more harder to plan or take longer time and so forth. Now, you can certainly, in many cases, people say, well, most of the group was underground. Well, you certainly can have, just like in the special operations community, you can have underground guerrillas, which you do, and you have underground auxiliary. All right, just sort of, this is just to sort of show that there is some differences. The main point here is that not every insurgent is the same, just like not everybody in the military is the same. And that's why I think we need to look a little closer at this. When we do clear, hold, build, you don't clear insurgents in clear. You clear guerrillas in clear. The rest of them, they're there, especially the underground. Why? Because the definition of underground is that member of the insurgency that can remain in occupied territory, which you're now occupying after you clear. So that's why this kind of thing is important. And I said, since then, these might be guerrillas, or they're probably the radicals. There might be underground. I don't know, but it did emphasize that they were doing something on the guerrilla side, a little more violent, and in this case, overt. This would be an example of auxiliary. I said, yeah, I got 2 pictures off the internet last night, but you know what? Unless they have a regular logistics chain, communications chain, financial chain, and sub leaders and sub groups, which I don't really think you have. That is why you went into the phases too fast, because in late incipient, you set up all these logistical communications, transportation, your messaging, your medical, and so forth. At this time, they had rung up my books. So I was ready to get out of there. And if you're thinking out there, Mark, why in the world would you help these guys? Listen, I help them about as much as if you asked me how to climb Everest. I said, get some good shoes, a good walking stick, a Sherpa, and walk up. Because it goes a lot farther than knowing the basic dynamics that have been around forever. Forever. And there's a lot more than just what we can discuss in an hour. I did have some other points. I said possibly you might want to look at an inner core in an organization. I said what you need is you need a leader. He needs to be charismatic. He needs to have some reputation, some resume. Maybe he's a professor, whatever you guys consider legit. But it can't be 19, and it can't be someone that is not, I would say, camera friendly or can't speak well. You want him to be somewhat leader-like. And you need an inner circle. You need those different people that are in charge of different, branches, if you will. Who's doing financing? Who's doing this? And I know they have a few out there, but there's one finance guy. They took a picture of him coming out of one of the most expensive hotels in Washington, D.C. That did not go over very well for 1%ers or 99%ers or what have you. So you might want to do a little bit of screening, indoctrination, and indoctrination just means you're kind of on the same sheet of music. That's all. It's like a commander's intent. So you can operate it decentralized, and then you spread them out to the different cities. So you need this kind of thing. You want to rein in or denounce other groups. Now, you can certainly have 3 or 4 different movements all working for the same objective, but they are different movements. Right now, you have them all under the same Whether you think so or not, everybody thinks they're all occupiers. So you have those radicals, anarchists, communists, socialists, the hippies, whatever. And that is why you've lost even some of the more progressive media, if you will. All right. Over time, they got worn down. The shop owners got worn down. The violence and so forth, probably done by a smaller number. You do need some quality control in your messaging because a lot of this has to do with credibility. All right. If you don't have a credible message, it's going to be difficult. This is a lack of quality control. This is probably too personal. I want to kind of curb some of these messages so that you don't give, like I said, I'm talking to them as an insurgent advisor, give too much fodder to the other side. So we have the dynamics. We have them all there. And as I stated, and this is back, last year, November, I don't see that you have these dynamics. You might have a few, but you can't have a few. You have to have them all. Even if they're not good, you still have to have them. And I said, that is the reason I told you didn't have a revolution, is because you didn't have an insurgency. You had a mob, an unorganized mob with no leader, no direction. You can't even kind of equate a message, a cohesive message. So they said, what do we need to do? And I said, like I said, you need to get a good leader, a circle of people, someone intelligent, and you need an advisor, a no-kidding technical advisor that knows insurgency, and counterinsurgency for that matter. And so I grabbed my books, and they said, like you? And I said, exactly like me. I said, the problem is that you want to stick it to the man. I work for the man. And I walked out. And that's basically the end of the story. I was having some fun with them. They were making fun of my book choices, so I decided to make fun of their life choices. But more seriously, I wanted to use this as an example where you can apply these dynamics anywhere. And a lot of times I get emails from different people or different conversations. They've applied them to historical cases like the Revolutionary War. I've even had one do a whole presentation on Red Dawn, a fictional story of insurgency. All right. And of course, what we did in Afghanistan and Iraq was we used these. And again, I will send you a document that is a real one. It's unclassified, but everything in there is real. That we did to analyze insurgencies in different provinces. And the so what of it is we were able to make those predictive analysis of what the enemy, not just what they're doing that we know about, but what they're doing that we don't know about and what they're going to do. And that's really the point I want to come to, is that when they do an action, I wanted to confirm a theory we already have on their courses of action, rather than us scratching our head and asking why, and then we're trying to figure out a purpose based on a task, which I think is very difficult, if not impossible, to do and be effective. So this one I thought I'd put up there. Counterinsurgency. Now, we're not going to talk about counterinsurgency, but in my opinion, I really think that the discussion, whether it's in literature, in FMs, in seminars, in anything, needs to have a balance of understanding insurgency if we're going to try and tackle something like counterinsurgency. And really, that's all I have. Thank you.
I think you covered it from A to Z, Colonel Ulrich. That was quite fascinating, and I think that's one of the most unique war stories I have ever heard, specifically about insurgencies. And in fact, what they were doing is not an insurgency. We'd welcome any questions you have. In the meantime, I just want to let you know that the charts that Colonel Ulrich used, we're going to hang them on our website. It'll be about a week or so before we can get them on there due to technical difficulties. And also the document he mentioned that's unclassified, that for those interested, how they did analysis of insurgency in Afghanistan. All these things I think are extremely useful for folks that are in the business. Okay, here's a comment from Eric Simmers. I'll give Colonel Ulrich a minute to look at that and comment. Bottom up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the guys like other movements utilize the same kind of idea in Algeria. Tupamaros in Uruguay. Um, Again, we were seeing these things in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people were saying these are new, or they came out in doctrine and someone just invented this. And it's actually, the best way to understand insurgency is to understand and read the insurgents. It reminds me of the movie Patton. If everybody remembers the movie, I think everybody's seen it, where Patton defeats Rommel's forces in northern Africa. Does everybody remember what he did? He screams that I read your book. I read your book. Well, how many times have we been able to scream that at the enemy we face in Philippines or Iraq or Afghanistan or Colombia, that I read your book? And believe it or not, they all write books, because unlike what they'd like you to think, that they're all of the people, most of them are not of the people. Most of them are intelligent, middle class. Castro was a lawyer. Che was a medical professional, doctor, dentist, something. Um, Fanon, a psychiatrist or psychologist. Mao was a librarian. I know that doesn't sound very scary, but in that culture, in that time, that was a scholar. Sendek was a lawyer. Marighella from Brazil, he was a legislator. So rarely are they really of no means. Even Zapata, the Mexican Revolution, came from a middle to middle lower class. So I'd urge, and I see some things about reading lists, certainly, and I've been trying to find you the address of this store if you're in Oakland.
Give another minute or so for folks to make comments, and just to let you know, in August, our next webcast will be on the 16th. We will give an update on how we're doing on the revision of FM 324, all the things that are going on right now, and so you can look forward to that. We have some additional webcasts for September as well, and we'll be putting out some information about that shortly. Give another 30 seconds or so for comments. Like one of Colonel Ulrich's classmates is up there. Okay, look forward to having some more of you folks that are plug into us the next time we do this on the 16th of August. Have a great day, all from the Counterinsurgency Center and the Irregular Warfare Fusion Cell. We're out.